Hi there. It's been a while since my last video on using Sequence Generator Pro, but a number of forum questions have prompted me to do this video, and that is specifically how to use Sequence Generator Pro and a software BISC Paramount. There are a number of settings both in Sequence Generator Pro, in PHD2 and in the SkyX that allows you to make them operate together and play nicely. First we're going to look at the SkyX, but before we can actually load it, in the standard configuration when the SkyX installs, it does not install an ASCOM driver. So you do need to locate the ASCOM driver from their website and install it. Now, if you look at Sequence Generator Pro and bring up a standard sequence panel, if we choose a telescope, the ASCOM driver is called ASCOM Telescope Driver for the Sky. And if you look at the settings, this is the first place where things can go wrong if you're not careful. These are the ASCOM settings, and I'm just going to run through them quickly. So the latest version of the SkyX, German equatorial, inhibit sync to protect T-point model. So if you're using the centering processes within Sequence Generator Pro, it uses a sync command back to the mount in order to center up within a few pixels. This can mess up the internal pointing model within the SkyX. Checking this button here stops it sending a sync pulse, and I'll show you in another dialogue how to get round that. Can find home. Paramounts need to find home, and other programs use this ASCOM driver, and I have an observatory control program that opens and closes the roofs and homes the mount and all that kind of good thing. Can set tracking, very important, be able to turn the tracking on and off. The mount can be parked, which is useful in the case of an observatory. And there's one about slew start delay for CPU hogging cameras. I'm not in a rush, so I prefer to be reliable. And then this is about the guiding. You can either do enable tracking offsets and pulse guide, which is the standard ASCOM pulse drive system. Or you can disable those two and leave this one connected, and this is the SkyX's own version. It works in a slightly different way, and I prefer it for a number of reasons. I think it works very slightly better in terms of guiding itself. But A, it doesn't need a cable or ST4, which is a good thing. And also, like Pulse Guide with ASCOM, it means that you can use a guiding camera that doesn't have an ST4 port at the back of it. Can get pointing state. That is useful so that Sequence Generator Pro knows which side of the pier it's on, and that helps if you want to do meridian flips. And there's a trace on, which if you ever have any problems, you can at least try and pin down what happened and when. So with all those okay, let's hit connect. And what typically happens when you hit connect, it loads up the SkyX, as you can hear in the background. So I'm just going to shrink this down for a second. And here is the SkyX. Now, what I'm going to do is zoom out. So this is my sphere of influence and my local horizon. And what we're going to take a look at is around the meridian, which is down here. And if you notice, either side of the meridian are these purple and sort of ruby red coloured bands. These are the settings within the SkyX which of the tracking limits around the meridian. So as the mount comes around, it goes past the meridian, and when it gets to the edge of here, it will stop tracking. And this is a software control built into the SkyX. There are also physical hardware stops within the mount, but these are much further round. Now, at the moment, these are set either side of the meridian. And there's a third little control on this screen that's not so obvious, that if you set it wrongly can cause you some problems. And that is something called the flip hour angle, and you can drag this within the boundaries of your limits here, and the best place to put it is actually on the 0 line. I'm going to leave it there just for a second and show you how to set up these limits with the dialog boxes within the SkyX. So you need to be connected to the mount, it doesn't have to be homed, and under the Tools section there's something called BESC TCS. And there's a number of different parts of this that we need to take a look at. So the flip hour angle we were just looking at was set to 0.21, so I'm going to edit that and I'm going to make it 0. So it highlights it now in red, and if you look at the screen it's now popped back to the meridian. And the other one I'm going to do is on the Utilities tab. I'm looking at the mount slew limits. Now this is where it not only limits the slew but also it does a tracking stop. And if you look at this number here, if I put 0.99 in, you can see that it's changed the limit on one side of the mount. So it's much more on this side than this side. So these numbers here are in fractions or whole numbers of an hour. So what I typically do is have half an hour both sides. So it's 0.5 on that side and minus 0.5 on that side. So once I've gone through those dialogues, it's back to where it was, so it's equidistant, plus or minus half an hour either side of the meridian. So with all those done, I can go back to the parameters and do save all parameters to mount. So now the mount will remember that and I can close this down. Now we're just going to remember that plus or minus half an hour because what we do in Sequence Generator Pro is initialize a meridian flip within this boundary. You can't do it outside because it'll stop slewing. So we have to make sure that whatever boundaries we set in SGP are within plus or minus half an hour. So if I flip back to SGP and if I pull up the control panel and look at the telescope tab, let's look at some of the options. So park when sequence completes or stop tracking when sequence completes, it doesn't really matter which. I typically park because then if it rains the roof can close safely. I'm going to use auto meridian flip, so I click on here and this is where you set the limits. So at the moment it's set to 0. Now the longest exposure I ever make is 20 minutes, so I'm going to make this 22 minutes. That's less than 30 minutes, so it'll always flip within the boundaries. It'll wait for the meridian so it doesn't accidentally flip with the weight still pointing up. And I'm going to auto center after the meridian flip. So that means it'll slew round back to the other side of the meridian to the same target. It'll do the auto centering process using astrometry, and away you go. And there's a delay. I don't need a huge long delay, so I normally set it to 5 seconds. The last control is this one here, the sync behavior. Now we've already told the ASCOM driver to block sync commands, so there are a number of other options for working out how to sync the mount, and the one that works for me and for others is using target offset. Now with that set, with or without a T-point model in the SkyX, I normally only need one correction and I'm within a few pixels. The mounts are pretty good in regard to backlash, so it'll take a reading, it'll plate solve it, it'll say there's an error, it'll do a small slew, plate solve again after an exposure, and away you go. So that's what I set. I briefly mentioned about T-point. So in this case I have got a T-point running and it's pretty good. It's pointing within 5 arc seconds. This isn't necessary. I have 2 rigs. This particular rig is permanently bolted in a observatory, so it's worth doing a T-point model. The other one's on a tripod. I don't normally bother. But what I do to make life as easy for me as possible, with both rigs I make sure that the computer clock is accurate. and I use a program called Dimension 4, which is a free program that accesses network time protocol servers, and it synchronizes the time. And you can see on my computer, if I look over several months, my computer is pretty hopeless at keeping time, so this is something that powers up and synchronizes my computers with the internet when they power up, and it's good for the rest of the night. So I can close that for a second. And the other thing is, in terms of alignment, so the telescope mount in the observatory is aligned within about an arc minute. The one in the garden is about 2 arc minutes. So while I've set it all up, what I've done is made sure that I can put the tripod and the mount back into the same position. So I do not polar align my portable mount every time I use it in the back garden. If I have to travel, to a dark field site, then clearly I'll need to polar align. So those are the settings that I use, and I'm hoping that that'll be useful to you. There's one small caveat, and that is that occasionally the SkyX doesn't play nicely with the ASCOM driver, and it can happen that these settings that you set here can get changed, not by you but by the system. So the ASCOM driver, if it gets an error message back after sending a particular command a few times, like asking for the pointing state, it makes an assumption that pointing state is not supported by the telescope mount that's connected to the SkyX, and it will disable it. So occasionally you get some strange error messages, or it'll stop guiding. And the reason it stopped guiding is that it got an error message when a direct guide command was sent, and it said, oh, it can't possibly do that because it must be a Losmandy or a Skywatcher mount connected to the SkyX, and so therefore I'll disable direct guide. So it's worthwhile checking these settings every so often to make sure they haven't disabled themselves on the fly. The last thing before I sign off is PhD2. So if I pull it up, when you look at the settings here, I've only got 2 settings because I'm using a pulse guide system through the SkyX. If you are using ST4, then this would need to be on camera. And then if you wanted to know what your mount's right ascension was or declination, then you would need to set the ASCOM driver for the Sky here instead. But as it is, I don't need both, I just need that. So there you have it. Hopefully this is useful. I'll ask Ken and Jared to put a pin on this one, because this question about using the SkyX comes up quite regularly. The last question I'm sure people will ask is, do I get better guiding with ProTrack? And the answer is not always. Sometimes it works better, and sometimes it makes very little difference. So if I've got a permanent mount, I'll try and use it. If I've got a portable system, I'm not going to worry about it. Okay, thank you for watching.